Okay, good morning. Me again. Final installment of Roald Dahl's Esio Trot. And that brings us nicely, finishing that story. And then next week, when we're all at school together, we'll start a brand new story in class. So earlier on in the week, you had the second installment, and it got to the point where Mr. Hoppy's plan was coming into action, and he was swapping the tortoises every week for a slightly bigger tortoise to try and trick, I suppose, Mrs. Silver that her tortoise is growing when she says that magic poem. So we're going to find out what happens. See if the plan works, to see if they fall madly in love and live happily ever after, or if she discovers his ways and it doesn't work and she demands little Alfie back and they never speak to each other again. Imagine. Hang on, let's make that a bit different. All right. We're on a school laptop. Look, I think you'll be able to see it quite well. We finished off last session here. Very slowly, over 7 weeks, Mrs. Silver's pet had more than doubled in size, and the good lady hadn't noticed a thing. Even to Mr. Hoppy, peering down over his railing, tortoise number 8 looked pretty big. It was amazing that Mrs. Silver had hardly noticed anything at all during the great operation. Only once had she looked up and said, "You know, Mr. Hoppy, I do believe he's getting a bit bigger. What do you think?" "I can't see a lot of difference myself," Mr. Hoppy had answered casually. "I think Mr. Hoppy's a bit sneaky, to be honest. I know he's doing it because he's madly in love with her and he wants to sort of impress her, but he's a sneaky character." Right. Now perhaps it was time to call a halt. And that evening, Mr. Hoppy was just about to go and suggest to Mrs. Silver that she ought to weigh Alfie, when a startled cry from the balcony below brought him outside fast. "Look!" Mrs. Silver was shouting. "Alfie's too big to get through the door of his little house. He must have grown enormously." "Weigh him," Mr. Hoppy ordered. "Take him in and weigh him quick." Mrs. Silver did just that, and in half a minute she was back holding the tortoise in both hands and waving it above her head and shouting, "Guess what, Mr. Hoppy? Guess what? He weighs 27 ounces. He's twice as big as he was before." "Oh, you darling!" she cried, stroking the tortoise. "Oh, you great big wonderful boy! Just look what a clever Mr. Hoppy has done for you." Mr. Hoppy suddenly felt very brave. "Mrs. Silver," he said, "do you think I could pop down to your balcony and hold Alfie myself?" "Why, of course you can," Mrs. Silver cried. "Come down at once." Mr. Hoppy rushed down the stairs to Mrs. Silver's and Mrs. Silver opened the door to him. Together they went out onto the balcony. "Just look at him," "Just look at him," Mrs. Silver said proudly. "Isn't he grand?" "He's a good-sized tortoise now," Mr. Hoppy said. "And you did it," Mrs. Silver cried. "You're a miracle man. You are indeed." "But what am I going to do about his house?" Mrs. Silver said. "He must have a house to go into at night, but now he can't get through the door." They were standing on the balcony looking at the tortoise. It was trying to push his way into the house, but he was too big. "I shall have to enlarge the door," Mrs. Silver said. "Don't do that," Mr. Hoppy said. "You mustn't go chopping up such a pretty little house. After all, he only needs to be just a tiny bit smaller, and he could get in easily." "How could he possibly get smaller?" Mrs. Silver asked. "That's simple," said Mr. Hoppy.
Change the magic words. Instead of telling him to get bigger and bigger, tell him to get a bit smaller. But in tortoise language, of course. Will it work? Ah, of course it'll work. Tell me exactly what I have to say, Mr. Hoppy. Mr. Hoppy got out a piece of paper and a pencil and wrote. Esio Trot, take a tib, rallans, a tib, rallans. You see it there? That'll do it, Mrs. Silver, he said, handing her the paper. I don't mind trying it, Mrs. Silver said. But look here, I wouldn't want him to get titchy small all over again, Mr. Hoppy. He won't, dear lady, he won't, Mr. Hoppy said. Say it only tonight and tomorrow morning, and then see what happens. We might be lucky. If it works, Mrs. Silver said, touching him softly on the arm, then you'll never alone.
Not sure about clever, more sneaky.
The next afternoon, as soon as Mrs. Silver had gone to work, Mr. Hoppy lifted the tortoise up from her balcony and carried it inside. All he had to do now was to find one that was a shade smaller so that it would go through the door of the little house. He chose one and lowered it down with his tortoise catcher. Then, still gripping the tortoise, he tested it to see if it could go through the door. It wouldn't. He chose another. Again, he tested it. This one went through nicely. Good. He placed the tortoise in the middle of the balcony beside a nice piece of lettuce and went inside to wait for Mrs. Silver's homecoming.
You see him there? It's him with his tortoise catcher, lowering the different tortoise in. That evening, Mr. Hoppy was watering his plants on the balcony when suddenly he heard Mrs. Silver's shouts from below, shrill with excitement. Mr. Hoppy, Mr. Hoppy, where are you? She was shouting. Just look at this. Mr. Hoppy popped his head
Over the railings and said, "What's up?" "Oh, Mr. Hoppy, it's worked!" She was crying. "Your magic words have worked again on Alfie. He can now get through the door of his little house. It's a miracle." "Come down, have a look," Mr. Hoppy shouted back. "Come down at once, my dear man," Mrs. Silver answered. "Come down and see the wonders you have worked upon my darling Alfie." Mr. Hoppy turned and ran from the balcony into the living room, jumping on tiptoe like a ballet dancer between the seamed tortoises that cluttered the floor. He flung open his front door and flew downstairs 2 at a time, with the love songs of 1,000 cupids ringing in his ears. "This is it," he whispered to himself under his breath. "The greatest moment of my life is coming up now. I mustn't push it. I mustn't push it. I must be very calm." When he was 3/4 of the way down the stairs, he caught sight of Mrs. Silver already standing at the open door, awaiting to welcome him with a huge smile on her face. She flung her arms around him and cried out, "You really are the most wonderful man I've ever met. You can do anything. Come in at once and let me make you a cup of tea. That's the very least you deserve." Seated in a comfortable armchair in Mrs. Silver's parlour, sipping his tea, Mr. Hoppy was all of a titter. He looked at the lovely lady sitting opposite him and smiled at her. She smiled right back at him. That smile of hers, so warm and friendly, soon gave him the courage he needed, and he said, "Mrs. Silver, please will you marry me?" "Why, Mr. Hoppy," she cried, "I don't think you ever had to rescue me. Of course I'll marry you." Mr. Hoppy, Mr. Hoppy got rid of his teacup, and the two of them stood up and embraced warmly in the middle of the room. It's is all due to Alfie, Mrs. Silver said, slightly breathless. Good old Alfie, Mr. Hoppy said. We'll keep him forever. Mr. Hoppy took all his other tortoises back to the pet shops and said they'd have them for nothing. Then he cleaned up his living room, leaving not a leaf of cabbage nor a trace of tortoise. And a few weeks later, Mrs. Silver became Mrs. Hoppy, and the two of them lived very happily ever after. P.S. What happened to little Alfie, the first of them all? Well, he was bought a week later from one of the pet shops by a small girl called Roberta. Roberta's spoiled, and settled down in Roberta's garden. She fed lettuce and tomato slices and crispy celery, and in the winter hibernated with a box of dried leaves and toast. But for a time then, Roberta has grown now, is married, and has 2 children of her own. She lives in another house, but Alfie is still with her, still a much loved family pet. Roberta thinks that by now he must be about 23 years old. It has taken him all that time to grow to twice the size he was when Mrs. Silver had him. But he made it in the end.
And that, children, is the end of Esio Trot. Is that what you thought would happen? Was that part of your prediction? What a lovely, happy ending to a really fun story, hey? Thank you so much for listening really well and for taking part in any of the little questions or tasks I've asked you to do. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did, and I look forward to seeing you next week and we will start a brand new story. Take care, everybody. Have a brilliant weekend. I'll see you soon. Bye.